Hello, Edward here from 088. In this session, we're going to be talking all about groups and all of the various useful tools that they bring. Well, a good start is, well, what is a group? Well, by group we mean groups of lights. So the ability to essentially create ourselves some shortcuts to different bunches of lights in our rig. That's kind of the fundamentals of what a group is. But as we'll see in this session, there's all sorts of other benefits that these groups can bring us. So on my screen here, I have top right, first of all, I've got some visualization software running. So I'm using Capture visualization software just so we can see what we're doing with our lights in our virtual venue. And then I'm also running here Phantom Zeros. So Phantom Zeros, this allows me to emulate any console running the Zeros operating software. So in my example here, for the purposes of this, I am emulating a Flex console. So I'm emulating the full-size Flex console for this session. But as we'll go through, I'll kind of explain maybe slight differences for if instead maybe you're using a FLX S console, for example, as we go through. So I mentioned there, well, why do we use groups? What's the point of these groups? And I said that they're these shortcuts to our selections of lights. And we are able to create our own groups, or the console can actually create some groups for us. So the first thing I'm actually going to do, I'm going to take my lighting state down here. I'm going to go into Setup. I'm going to go to Clear Options, and I'm going to go and do a Clear All and say yes. And that's going to remove any programming that was in this show file, and that allows us to kind of work through from afresh as we go through this session. So now I've done that, we can start to explore what our groups are all about. Let's talk about where we can access these groups first of all. We have our groups window that allows us to view these groups. On all consoles, we can view that on the internal touchscreen. I'm going to close this window and I'm going to open this window here. And this window is emulating my internal touchscreen. To open your groups window on the full-size Flex, you can tap the group key, and the group key is part of your syntax pad. Or if you're on a Flex S console, you will have a little 4 tiles icon at the top of your touchscreen. Tap that, and that will open your groups window. As well as opening it on the internal touchscreen, if you're using a console with an external monitor, you will be able to go to the groups desktop. So the last desktop there contains the groups window, and the top left window here is also my groups window. I'm going to close the external monitor for now and go back to using the internal touchscreen for now. And so what I have here is all I've got in my show file is I've just got my fixtures patched. So if I go in on my channel faders, I'll be able to go and control the intensities of my lights, but nothing else has been configured in my show file. So the next thing I can do is I can actually go in here and automatically create myself some groups. So if I go to the groups window, click automatically create groups, the console's going to look at what fixtures you've currently got patched in. I'm working down that first column in my groups window now. The console's gone in and created a group for each different type of fixture that I've patched into my console. If you want to know more about patching, how we actually get these lights into the console in the first place, go and check out our dedicated patching training sessions. So I've got a group to select all of my wash fixtures, for example, or a group to select all my spots. I could go in and select all of my wash beams, for example. So just each different type of fixture that I have in my console, I can click on and it selects that bunch of lights. So as we can see, it is just a shortcut to selection. So all of my wash fixtures, well, those I've patched them in onto lights 1 through to 10. So me clicking on that actually is exactly the same as me going in and clicking lights 1 through to 10, like that. It's doing the same thing. It's selecting those 10 lights. And selection is really important, because selecting a light, the console will then show you the controls available to allow you to control that light further. So things like your colour controls or your position controls, for example. So we have to select our lights to tell the console what lights we want to control. When we've got lights selected, I can also tap Z and then use my intensity wheel. So I can tap my Z button and the intensity wheel on your first encoder there will control the brightness of any currently selected fixtures. So you can use a group to select them and then use the intensity wheel to adjust their intensity if you wish to. Now, if you're on the Flex or using a FLX S with an external monitor, for example, in this window we've just got a few other options here. So if I go and select a group of lights, I can then start to click to add all of these groups together. So what I've done there is if I can click on my washes to select my washes. I could then click on my spots to also select my spot fixtures. If I select my wash fixtures, adjust for example, their intensity, and then go to my groups, next time I click, I don't add to the selection, I start again. So if you select a light, make a change, the next time you click on a group, by default, it will then deselect the previous group. Whereas, if you select a group, don't make a change, select a new group, you can add, and you can start to add multiple groups together. Unless you force the console into single select, and that will mean you can only ever have a single group selected at a time. When you go into single select, you then get a couple of buttons appear, so I can say, and that group, and that group, except that group. So when you go into single select, it will then allow you to manually add or take away, if you like, groups of selection. And when I've then made that customization, I've now got my washes and my LED cyc lights. I can now go to my intensity wheel and control all of those together. So I can access these functions from my internal touchscreen of Flex or the external groups window for consoles with a external monitor. As well as that, I get a clear button, clear selection appear. That will also be there when I'm in multi-select, so either of those options, and that will allow me to, as the name suggests, clear my selection. As you'll see there though, it won't clear out any manual values. Okay, so it's like basically the first step of your clear button on the console. If you're not familiar with the clear button on the console, if I go and select some lights, turn them on, tapping clear once will clear the selection, a second tap of clear will clear any manual control values out. Whereas this clear button here is just dealing with selection. So it can just be used to clear the current selection of lights. It won't clear any manual values out. So those are some useful tools to be aware of when we're starting to use this groups window. So I mentioned that we can go and grab the different groups of different types of lights, but then the console's gone and broken that down further. So running down the columns, the next column that's available are all of the odds of a particular type of light. So I can go and grab all of the odd fixtures of my washes. Clicking on that is exactly the same as me going and saying 1, 3, 5, 7, 9 for these particular group of lights. And you guessed it, we've got an even equivalent of that as well. So the nice thing about that is I could go and say those fixtures, turn them on, and I'm going to have those ones in a red, and I could then go to my groups, next set of fixtures, and I could go and have them in a blue, for example. So I can start to quickly grab odds and evens just directly using some auto groups. I'm going to double tap clear, clear the selection, and clear any manual values. Then we have the option for first half and second half. So that's really useful. You know, where that's probably going to come in most useful is for things like stage right and stage left. So I could select the stage right fixtures, which is my first half, and come and bring those on. Depending on how you've got your fixture numbers assigned, they might end up being upstage, downstage. Depends on how you've numbered your fixtures when you've patched them. But in my case here, the first half, because my Aleda wash fixtures are numbers 1 to 10, the first half is 1 to 5, second half is 6 to 10 in terms of the fixture numbers. And so we can see there, they are just really quick shortcuts to select those lights. I can select them, which is exactly the same as clicking on their relevant fixture numbers, or if you're on the full size flex, is essentially saving you having to type in syntax commands. For example, on the full size flex, if I wanted to get my odd fixtures, I could type in the syntax 1 and 3 and 5 and 7 and 9. And so I can instead use a group as a shortcut to grab those lights instead. Something else that we can then go in and do is something else that our groups allow us to do, and you might have seen me do this already, is I can double click on a group. And that is a really useful feature. If I single click, it will select those lights as we've seen. If I double click, that will select them and turn them on to full. So with our auto groups here, if you double click on an auto group, it will turn the fixtures in that group on to full. So that is a really useful tool. Double click it, they come on, bang. They might be my LED fixtures such as this. I could then go to my colour and start to go and mix onto those if I need to. So double clicking on a group is a very useful thing to be aware of. If I double click on a group, turns it on, double click again, it will turn it off, but leave it selected. So double click it once to turn them on, double click again to turn it off. And of course, I'm obviously doing it with my mouse at the moment because I don't have a touchscreen laptop. But you could be doing this, of course, on the touchscreen. Double tap and away you go. Turn the fixtures on to full. And so these are our auto groups that are available. Now I mentioned on Flex we have our syntax, of course, that we can use to type in commands. Well, we can use syntax commands on our Flex as well. That's why our group button on Flex is part of the group number pad. So if I want this group of lights at 50%, I could of course select them, go to my intensity wheel and dial those up to 50. Or if I'm on Flex, instead, what I can actually do is I could go and say, select a group, and then just literally dive in and say at 50 enter. Or I could do that all via syntax. So I could actually say group 1 at 50 enter. And that will also give me the same thing. So I typed in there group 1 at 50 enter. As well as, like we saw there, we have our single and multiple select options, which allow us to customize how we can select multiple groups in the groups window. I can also do a similar thing, but with syntax. So I could go and say group 1 and group 6 at 50 enter. And I can start to control multiple groups all at once, starting to use some syntax commands there, which is useful to be aware of. I'm going to go and double tap my clear button. So these auto groups are great. They're there to help you get started, select different bunches of lights. We can start to double click on those to grab controller lights and turn them on to full. But of course, if it's your rig, you're going to want to customize your own groups, and you're going to want to go in there and record your own custom groups. And so let's start to program up some custom groups. To record a group, you need to first of all select the lights that you want. You can then tap record, and you can then go and store that in to an empty group. So I'm actually going to go in and say I want lights 1, 2, 5, 6, and 9 and 10. Maybe I want to say, okay, well, I'm regularly using that bunch of lights together, and so actually I want to be able to record a group for myself to make it easier to recall those fixtures. So when you've made your selection, so I did it using the buttons here, you could have used syntax, so I could have actually said 1 and 2 and 5 and 6 and 9 and 10, enter, if you're on the Flex. And when I've done that, I can then tap my record button, and in my groups window, I can then go through and I will now see loads of empty groups marked with an asterisk. Depending on what console you're using, you will see you will have different numbers of groups available to you. On the full-size Flex, I have 240. And I can actually go and click in on any of these group marked with an asterisk. And that's then programmed in. So I selected the lights, I tapped record, and I tapped an empty group, and that's recorded that in. And now I can go and select those, and it will select those exact lights. I can double click it, and it will turn those lights onto full, just like we saw with our auto groups. Except, as I said, that is now a custom group. I could have also recorded that using syntax, so I'm just going to go and do exactly the same thing again. I'm going to say 1 and 2 and 5 and 6 and 9 and 10. And I'm then going to say record group 27, enter. And that will store it straight in. So if you're on Flex, you can say record group number, enter. What we can also do on Flex is you can name the group at the point of recording. Now we can see in here, the console's given it a automatic name. So it's just named it with the name of the fixtures and the fixture numbers. But let's say that actually I want to call these overhead or something like that. This time I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to say 1 and 2 and 5 and 6 and 9 and 10, enter. I'm then going to say record group 28, name. And I can then give this a name such as overhead. And that will then record the group in with the custom name. Now, if you're on Flex S, for example, you don't have a name button. And so for all of us, we can, of course, name the groups after we've recorded them. If you want to do that and you're on Flex, tap the name button once and tap a group. You can give it a name. You can also use a bit more syntax. So you could actually say, for example, group 27 name. That will also bring up the ability to name it. Or you can hold the setup key, down and tap on the group you want to name. So if you're on a Flex S console, hold setup and tap the group on the touchscreen, and that will allow you to name it. And you can start to give your groups custom names, and that will allow you then to very quickly see what you've got and grab control of your different bunches of lights very quickly. It will speed that process up for you. So we've seen there that our groups are recording our selection of lights. A group is our recording to a selection of lights. What I'm going to do this time is I'm going to go and say 1 through 6, enter. And I'm going to then go and record that to group 31. I could have also recorded that by pressing and holding fixture number 1 and tapping fixture number 6. Tap record, tap an empty group, and you'll see it also names it 1 through 6. This time though, I'm going to press and hold fixture number 6 and tap fixture button 1. So this time I held fixture button 6, tapped fixture button 1. Equally, I could have used the syntax 6 through 1 enter, and I'm now going to record that as a group. So I now have, well in my case, I now have 3 groups, all of them controlling the same bunch of lights. All of them contain lights 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 and 6. However, we can see from the automatic name, the console's realised what's going on here. And it's got, okay, well this group is 1 through 6, but this group is 6 through 1. Now on the face of it, if I double click either, I'm going to get the same results. However, that group is not just recording the selection information, it's recording the order that those lights were selected in as well. And that is really important and really useful for when it comes to fanning colours, positions, or where you might actually use this more often is actually with your effects. We're not going to explore effects in detail in this session, but I can just show you, if I select 1 through 6, I then go to my effects, create myself some effects, and I then go and say chaser. I get my lights running that way. But if I go and say grab this group of lights, go and choose exactly the same effect, I will get the effect running in the reverse order, because the effect is running across the order of selection. And so that means it essentially gives another layer, if you like, of your effects, because it means that you can use one effect, but with different groups, you're going to get different orders running across your stage. So that's something that's really useful to be aware of. Now, another benefit to using effects with groups is I can start to run effects across bunches of lights. So what I mean by that is if I go and say 1 through 8, enter, go to my effects and apply a chaser, that's going to run across each individual light. A typical kind of chaser effect. But what I could do instead is I could start to make myself some groups of bunches of those lights. So I'm going to create a group which is just the first 2 of lights. Record to there. I'm now going to do a group which is the next pair. And I'm going to then do a group of the next pair. And I'm then going to do a group of the next pair. Now what I'm going to say is I'm going to say I want that group, that group, that group, that group. Go to my effects, run my chaser, and this time use my offset by group buttons. And I can now start to bunch those lights together. And so that means that now that I'm bunching those together, I can have pairs of lights doing the same thing rather than singles. And so it just makes your lighting more interesting when you're starting to do bunches of lights together. You could have bunches of 3s chasing. This could be a position effect, for example. I could have these lights running in a circle, offset by group. So I'm having pairs of lights moving together. You know, there's all sorts of things you could do, but it just adds another layer of your groups, of your effects, the ability to offset by group. So it's a useful thing to be aware of. So we've seen there that our groups record selection, but also the order of selection as well. And that's really useful when it comes to effects. Now this time, what I'm going to do is I obviously recorded these groups before with lights 1 through to 6. This time, I'm going to go and chuck up faders 1 through to 6 to random levels. Now when you push up channel faders, on flex range consoles by default, those fixtures will select for you. So when you raise the intensity of a light, it will select. And so, yep, happy days, I've got lights 1 through 6 selected again. I'm going to record that as another group for myself. I'm then going to go and do double tap clear. And this time, I'm going to double tap this group. And if I go to my output window, take a look at what's happened. Rather than those lights just going straight to full, which is what they do if I go and apply one of these groups that I programmed earlier, they go to full there, but if I go and double click the group that I just programmed, instead, these fixtures are going to the levels that were present at the point of recording the group. So if you record a group of lights, so you're recording the selection of the lights, the console will also look at the intensity those lights are at, and it will also include that in the group as well. So if you record a group of lights and there's no intensity information, when you double click on that group, it will take those fixtures on to full. That's what we were seeing happening before. But now I've just recorded this group and there was intensity information present because I'd just gone and chucked the intensities up with my faders. And double clicking on that group is now recalling those intensities. So I can actually use my groups as shortcuts to intensities. And that's something that's really useful to be aware of. They can be a shortcut to your intensities. So now, let's say in this example here, I've got my lights all at their different levels. I haven't needed to customize that, all of those different levels. I've just double tapped my group to recall it. And I can now use my intensity wheel. And you'll see there that as I move that wheel, all of those levels are staying relative to one another. And so it means you can do the prep work first of getting all of your lights to the various levels required. Maybe it's a front of house wash. And in your front of house wash, you've got several fixtures and they all need to be at maybe slightly different levels to get a perfect wash across your stage. You can then record all of those variations into a group. And then whenever you need the front light, you can just double click on that group and you don't need to configure those individual intensities of each light. You can just recall it all at once. And so that's something to really useful to be aware of. I didn't manually tell the console, I want you to include intensities. It just does it. Groups will store intensities if there is intensity present at the point of recording it. Something to be aware of though, if I go and, I'm going to double tap clear, if I just select that group and now bring up the intensity wheel, they will all come up together. It is only if you double click on that group that the console realizes, right, you're recalling the intensity information, and then when I use the intensity wheel, you're going to be then keeping them relative to one another. So if you record a group, you've recorded intensities, maybe you recorded those intensities accidentally, for example, well, you can still single tap that group and dial it up, and they will all just come on from 0 altogether. So it's just when you're double clicking that actually the intensity information can be recalled if required. We'll explore some of the other benefits of our intensity groups a little bit later. Something else worth mentioning at this point is your groups window is a 5 wide grid. And so what you might want to start to think about is, okay, well, how can I lay out this groups window? And so what a lot of people do is they will essentially view this as if it's kind of a bird's eye view of your rig. Maybe running along the top row there, maybe that's, for example, your sight lights. Maybe along this row here is your front light. And you can start to place out group tiles in this window relative to where those lights may be in your stage. It's just a suggestion. You don't have to do that, of course. You can just record them all one after the other, just so you've got this centralized pool of different shortcuts. But one option that you might want to do, and certainly what some people do like to do, is actually kind of lay it out a little bit like a simplified bird's eye view of your rig, as it were, in the locations that those fixtures may be at, just to speed up control of your lights. We've spoken about naming our groups, which will also help you really quickly work out where your fixtures are, which group is which lights. But something else we can do as well is we can copy groups, and that might be useful, well, firstly, of course, to make a copy if you want to have a duplicate, or it might be useful to actually use as a means of actually rearranging where these groups are within the groups window. To copy a group, that is a syntax process, and you can use the syntax group. You can then type the number of the group you want to copy. So I'm going to say group 28, tap the copy button, and then say where you want to paste it. So in this case here, I'm going to type group 28, copy 40, enter. And that will copy group number 28 and paste it to group number 40. I could then go ahead and delete number 28 by tapping delete, tap on the group you want to get rid of, and I've instead got that group now being controlled here. So I deleted a group there by tapping delete and then tapping it. If you're on Flex, you can also use a little bit of syntax. So you could go and say group 40 delete. And you can also delete a group using that method. I'm going to go and click no. So that is copying, and that's also deleting. Now, as we saw with our group here, our groups are recording selection, order of selection, and intensity information if present as well. And what you might end up needing to do is actually update a group. Maybe you want to update the intensities that are stored within the group. Or maybe actually you need to make a change to the selection. So let's say that I'm going to go and I'll double click on that group there that I programmed earlier. I'm now going to go and view my output window, and I'm actually going to, well, firstly I'm actually going to bring in a new light to that level, but I'm also going to just go and adjust some of the levels of those existing lights. Tweak those levels. When I'm happy with my changes that I've made, I'm going to close that window now. When I'm happy with my changes, you can tap the update button, and you can then go and click on the group that you wish to update. On Flex, you could also use the syntax update group, type the number, and tap enter. Give it a click. You'll get a very quick progress bar as those changes are saved. I can now tap clear, double click my group, and my new updated intensities and updated selection, because I've now got a new light added in, will be recalled. Notice though the name hasn't changed. When I recorded that group, it recorded as 1 through 6, and I then didn't edit that group. And so even though I've got a new light added in now, group number 8, fixture number 8, sorry, well, the group name hasn't updated yet. It hasn't changed. When you update a group, it will not overwrite the name that's already there. So, just worth mentioning. I'll go and tap clear to deselect that. I'm going to go and take my faders down here because I like my console nice and tidy. Take those down to 0. And the next thing we'll do is we'll take a look at actually starting to use our groups, and specifically using the intensities of our groups to record some cues. So this time I'm going to go and double click on this group, and I'm going to go and record onto my master playback. I'll double tap clear, push up my master playback, and that's of course recorded that lighting state. I'm going to go and double tap enter. Really useful shortcut to be aware of. If you double tap enter, that will select any lights that are currently on above 0%. And I'm then going to go and tap Z to view my intensity wheel. So if you tap your Z button on the first encoder will be your intensity wheel. And let's take a look at what our intensity wheel is actually showing me here. It's now showing me, rather than simply the intensity percentage of the first fixture, I'm seeing I35. And I then have the intensity of the first fixture in brackets. At 21 in this case. So I'm seeing I35 and then the actual percentage in brackets. And you'll see, you'll be used to seeing something very similar if you're going to your colours and applying colours. You'll see the palette number there, C2, colour palette 2, and then the raw value in brackets. And we're now seeing exactly the same thing, but for intensity. And that's to do with referencing. Because what happened there is when I recorded my lighting state here into the master playback, all I'd done is I had double tapped my group and recorded that to the master playback. And so the console essentially thought, okay, well, I'm using this fixture, but its intensity is coming from the group. And so rather than recording the raw intensity value, I'm actually just going to reference that group. And so this particular cue here does not have raw intensity information stored in. That's what I'm seeing here in my intensity wheel. And instead, it is purely referencing the intensities in that particular group. Now, what that means is if I go and update my group, any cues that use that particular group for their intensities will also be updated. So let's do that now. Double click those fixtures. I'm actually going to be lazy and I'm just going to dial their intensities down. Dial those down a touch. I'm then going to go to my output window. I'm just going to fine tune those a little bit. Let's bring in those lights a touch. Great, I'm happy with that. I might actually bring light 8 down even further. And now I've done that, I'm going to tap update. I'm going to click on my group. And now I've done that, I can double tap clear, raise my playback, and it is now using the updated intensity values from the group. I did not update my playback, I only updated the group. And in fact, any playbacks, any cues that I'd recorded using that group will have updated for me as well. So again, that's another really useful tool that you can use for your groups. You can have all sorts of various different cues, all using one group. You can update the intensities within that group, and all of your cues have updated for you as well. And so that's what we call intensity referencing. Now, on the full-size Flex, we have a few bits of syntax that can help us out with this and allow us to have some extra tools available. And so let's explore those now. We've already seen that I can use syntax, group 2 at 50 enter. We've seen that, we're happy with that. That's fairly simple syntax that we can use. Now, group 35, if I double click that, that was my one at my various intensity levels. If I go and say group 35 at 50 enter, open my output window, all of those fixtures that were in that group go to 50%. Happy days. It's exactly the same as me single clicking on that group and dialing their fixtures intensity to 50%. But this time what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and type group group. And notice how intensity group is written in. So if you double tap the group key, the console now knows that I'm interested in intensities. So if I do group group 35 at, it will take the fixtures to the intensities that were recorded at the point of recording, or updating in my case here, that group. So group number at will take that group to the intensity levels in that group. If I do at 50, however, it will take them to 50% of the levels recorded. So I can now start to get into the situation where I could go and say group 35 at 50, enter. Imagine that's my front light. If I now need my front light, and remember I use that analogy of having my front light but all of those intensities at different levels, I can now get into the situation where I can say group 35 at 50, enter. That takes me to 50% brightness of that group, and all of those levels are staying relative to one another, as I can see here. So that is another really useful thing to be aware of. And the difference there is if I do group number at 50, enter, it will take those fixtures to 50%. If I do group number at 50%, it will take them to 50% of the recorded intensity values. Now, similarly, I could actually go and say 5, enter. I then might go and say at to turn that fixture on at full. But what I could do is I could say, oh, actually, I just want that fixture to be at the intensity that I programmed it at in group 35. And so to do that, I can literally go and say group 35, enter. And so if you select a light and then say group number, enter, it will take that fixture to the level it was at in that group. And so again, we can just use these as shortcuts for different intensity values. And if you then need to recall those equally, I could have gone and said, for example, 3 through 6, enter. I could then go and say group 35, enter. And so that's something really useful to be aware of, and it will then recall those levels. So 2 bits of syntax to be aware of then. Group number, enter. That will apply the current selected lights to the intensity stored in your group. Or group number at syntax will take your lights within that group to the percentage you define, and it will take them to the percentage of the recorded intensities. So 2 bits of syntax there that are really useful to be aware of. Great stuff. Now, another thing where groups can be really useful is, rather than using our groups window, rather than using syntax, I can also, on the full size flex, put a group onto a UDK. So rather than using syntax, rather than going into my groups window to select that particular group of lights, I can stick that group of lights on a button to allow me to very quickly grab control of those lights. So I might want to go and say, for example, maybe I'm regularly using all of my wash lights. I want to put group 1 on UDK number 4, for example. To do that, type group 1, tap record, and notice the playback buttons are not flashing. I've tapped record, and yet my playback faders are not flashing at me, and that's because the console knows I'm recording a shortcut, not channel data. So I've done group 1, record, and I'm then going to tap my UDK I want that on. In my faders window, I can now see that group 1 is now on my UDK, and I can see the group name displayed as well. And that means I can literally go in, select that group of lights, and I could tap home if I wanted to as well. Which is really useful to be aware of. So I've stuck them on there, and I can tap home. So if that's a group of lights that I use regularly, I could stick that on a UDK for me. The last thing I want to cover in this session, and it's just worth clarifying really, if you're on the full size flex, you can use this syntax in the fixture schedule as well. So I could go and say group 2 enter to select my odd group of lights, for example. I could go and say group 40 enter to select whatever lights that I had when I recorded my group 40. And again, because I've set up a UDK, I can use that in the fixture schedule as well to really quickly select my different groups of lights I need. And that is everything I wanted to go through today with groups. So we've looked at our different groups windows we've got available to us. We've looked at recording groups. We've looked at auto groups. We've also looked at naming, copying and deleting. We've looked at intensity groups, how we can store intensities, how we can recall intensities, and also how we can actually update those groups to maybe modify intensities if required. And then we've also looked at a little bit of syntax available. If you're on the full size flex with your dedicated syntax pad, we've also explored some of the dedicated syntax that's available to you. So I hope that's been useful. I hope that's maybe there's been some tips and tricks in there that you found, oh, I didn't even realise my console did that. And so I hope you found that session useful. If you've got any questions at all, please do drop us an email to support@088.com and we'll be able to help you out. Thank you for joining. See you on the next session.